Here's our panelists. I'm not going to do a full intro. Their bios are in your program. But the way that we're going to do this is Eric, who's a scholar in residence over at the Leeds School of Business, is going to start with a framing conversation for about 10 minutes or so. And then Harry Surden, who's a colleague here at the Colorado Law School, specializes in intellectual property, but also his research has taken focus in the areas of automated vehicles law and more recently automated contracts. So great to have Eric and Harry here. And then to Harry's right, your left, is Nathan Schneider. Nathan is a scholar in residence over in the CMCI school, where he's been interested in blockchain applications with a specific interest in decentralizing, or at least more widely spreading out ownership structures. And so that's where we're going to be going. I also want to introduce briefly Emma and Carlin, who are going to be front and center for the second panel that I've deputized to jump into the fray if you guys have something to add as we're going along. So with that, Eric, you'll start.
So it's great to see this much interest in what I think is a profoundly promising technology. I'd say I kind of got my academic interest in this topic kicked off by the namesake of my program, Hernando de Soto, who's known for his advocacy surrounding the importance of property rights, the importance of reliable and impartial institutions in developing nations. He's gotten interested in blockchain as a means of making property rights more reliable in developing countries. Frankly, I think real property is further off than many of the applications we're going to discuss today. I think there's promise there, but I'm more interested in the applications in Sweden and Singapore to property titling. Those are both countries that are piloting blockchain applications to their land registries. The countries that De Soto is focused on, developing countries, a lot of the problems with their land registries create problems for reliably entering that data into the blockchain in the first place. So that's where my interest kind of started on this, but what is a blockchain? It's basically a chain of code that is updated in discrete blocks based upon a predetermined consensus method. To me, the proof is usually in the consensus method for a particular blockchain. The most famous blockchain is that underlying Bitcoin, but there are other blockchains, those underlying Ripple, those underlying Ethereum, and they vary in minor or in significant ways in terms of the way their consensus method is determined. And so a blockchain generally is a technology that stores data in typically a decentralized, transparent, and secure way. The extent of decentralization is a fundamental function of the consensus method that the blockchain uses to validate each additional block of code that's showing updated transactions on that blockchain. And so it requires a cryptographic verification of all changes to a particular ledger. And especially in the case of Bitcoin and in Ethereum currently, there is no central authority that has exclusive power to append entries to the blockchain. The chain nature of the code provides immutability in that it only allows appending the code, updating it, referring to all previous transactions. So if Brad and Nathan each send me, 5 Bitcoin, and I want to then, I've got 10 Bitcoin now, I want to pay someone, and I say, okay, this person's public key, I want to send 8 Bitcoin to. The way the network processes that is it looks back at the signals, the inputs into my private address that's matched to a public address. Once it sees that I have a sufficient number of those inputs, then it will validate that particular transaction the next time a validating entity tries to update the blockchain. Why isn't it certain that a validating entity will update the blockchain? This has been likened to what's called the Byzantine generals problem. So imagine you've got an invading army and you've got a city under siege. And you've got 10 of your generals surrounding a city, each in a strategic vantage point. But some of those generals might be corrupted, some of those generals might be captured. So you're trying to, as a general or as the king of this army, you're trying to coordinate across generals that you can't see. They're sending you messages about this is the optimal time to invade this city. But how do you know, as the person that's collecting information from each of the individual generals, that they haven't been corrupted? That's the essence of a decentralized network, is how do you validate individual messages from decentralized nodes on that particular network? That is the consensus method. That is what causes different blockchains to vary from one to the other, and there's a lot of important characteristics that result from the particular consensus method being employed on a specific blockchain. These consensus methods, actually, I want to step back. There's a really important distinction to make between participants who can actually add blocks to the blockchain and users of the network. So people who are mining Bitcoins, simultaneously, they are also validating transactions on the Bitcoin network. Individual users who are buying Bitcoins, who are purchasing things with Bitcoins, who are paying other individuals with Bitcoins, they individually do not have the power to actually update the blockchain. So the consensus method is how do participants that actually have the potential to update the blockchain, how do they look at a proposed update to the blockchain and say, this is true, this is real, this is valid, this isn't fraudulent or opportunistic. These consensus methods vary based on, I'll name the four, what I consider to be the four most prominent or promising. Proof of work, which is what underlies Bitcoin. Proof of stake, which is something Ethereum is experimenting with because of problems associated with proof of work. There's also delegated proof of stake.
Proof of state?
Proof of stake. Stake in the network itself.
Got it.
So individuals or participants in the network will basically post something almost equivalent to a bond in terms of the amount of Ethereum that they hold. And that makes then, in this, it still hasn't been operationalized in practice, but the amount of stake that they've posted or hold in the network is effectively their chance as a proportion of all the stake that's been shown to the network. That's their chance of being the next person who adds a block to that particular chain.
Proof of stake is basically Austrian economics to proof of work's Keynesian economics, with all of the problems there.
And so there's also delegated proof of stake, which overcomes some problems of the market power of individuals who might hold a lot of Ether, being able to be the one who could consistently update that blockchain. If individuals in a particular network have a sufficient stake, their ability to update the blockchain in some senses weakens the decentralized nature of that particular blockchain. That led to the emergence of what's called delegated proof of stake, which is effectively individuals can authorize another entity to represent their comparatively small stake in the network. Finally, there's also practical Byzantine, it's actually called PBFT, I'm forgetting the other two acronyms, but this was developed by the people who coined the Byzantine generals problem in the first place. And it's basically authorized network users reach their individual conclusions about proposed additions to the blockchain, and then they reach consensus based on some predetermined consensus method. It might be simple majority, but there's nothing that says it has to be simple majority. Remember, these are all rules that determine the chain of code that's created within a particular network. So if you're interested in the trade-offs that a particular network is creating, focus on the consensus method. So I want to, given that I'm already running out of time, I just want to give a brief survey of promising applications. If we want to talk about consensus methods more, I think that there's a lot more to say on that topic about the advantages and disadvantages of a particular consensus method. It'll vary depending on what you're looking to do. Ledgers for financial transactions often require high transaction rates with relatively few participants and immediate finality of commitment. That lends itself to a particular type of consensus method for validating proposed changes to the blockchain. But that might not work as well for, say, a consumer market that requires substantial throughput across a large number of participants. So the nature of what you're trying to accomplish with a particular blockchain will tell you which consensus method or the trade-offs that your choice of consensus method force on you is optimal. Brief survey of promising applications, just if you're looking to look into actual companies that are applying blockchain now. Mojix, associated with Microsoft, is using both RFID scanners integrated with the Ethereum blockchain to provide greater interoperability between Internet of Things. Basically all of our devices that have small signatures that send out a signal telling you what it is, who you are, et cetera, et cetera. That's being interoperability between Internet of Things devices is a pretty big challenge because each company has its own underlying code that's running its particular Internet of Things, whether it's, a remote speaker in your home, whether it's, the temperature settings across your home that you can set with your phone. All of those things require interoperability in order to function better. You want them all to be able to speak to one another. Mojix is looking into that from the perspective of using the Ethereum blockchain. They're also doing some interesting stuff on supply chain innovations, especially surrounding foods. R3 and Axoni are the two groups that are developing blockchain applications for financial institutions. I'm curious if they're eventually going to be at loggerheads with one another, because it seems like, I think R3 is based in New York and Axoni is based in London, and major financial institutions, I'd say about 70 are supporting R3, and a good number are supporting Axoni. IOTA is another group that's doing interesting stuff in the Internet of Things. Tether, which is an interesting one to watch right now, is basically providing benefits of blockchain-based currency transactions, but backed by fiat currencies. So a lot of people that have benefited from the massive price increases in Bitcoin have bought into Tether because they don't want to take capital gains taxes on their Bitcoin currently. That's leading to a problem for Tether, who is claiming that every single individual unit of their digital currency is backed by a fiat currency, which means suddenly they need a huge influx of capital to make Tether continue to work. And finally, I want to note about Sovereign, because there are a lot of interesting political applications that we might hear more from Nathan about that are surrounding blockchain. In theory, it allows for almost perfectly decentralized voting, in which you might not even need a politician in the future if everyone can vote at low cost on a particular piece of legislation. Constituents in a particular district, their votes basically determine an outcome on a piece of legislation as opposed to a representative that they delegated that responsibility to. So that's a really interesting example of the disintermediating power of blockchain. And with that, I'll step to the panel.
Eric, that was great. Thank you. Let's go with things. Harry and Nathan, in terms of what is blockchain, what would you add or supplement to Eric's framing discussion? And in particular, if you'd start with, I'm talking to, let's say, grandma or grandpa who maybe hasn't necessarily been thinking about blockchain, basics of, here's what it is, and then any other nuance that you want to add.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think the blockchain is a real technological innovation, and it does solve some problems and bring totally novel functionality to some extent. So the way I like to think about it is the blockchain is a distributed database, which means that it's a database that can exist in thousands or even millions of places all over the world. And through this technological innovation, they figured out a way to make sure all the databases are the same, no matter where they are. That's the consensus mechanism that you were talking about. So you have this mechanism where you have these databases that are all the same, and it's really hard to fake or tamper with the data. And if you think about that, that's a pretty impressive feat, because if you took a bunch of data and spread it out over 1,000 different places, anybody could tamper with their copy of the database. So to have developed a mechanism that can detect when any one person has changed their data in the database, that's kind of an amazing feat. So the way to think about the blockchain is through its most famous use is as a ledger for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a so-called cryptocurrency, and like any currency, you have to keep track of who has what money and who's given what money to who. So Bitcoin uses blockchain as a database that keeps track in millions of different places around the world called nodes of who owns what amount of Bitcoin. And it's really hard to fake the amount of Bitcoin that you own. It's really hard to go back and undo, nearly impossible to tamper with or fake the data. So what I think is a real innovation because it solves a couple of problems. In the past, when we wanted to have a database that was reliable and trusted, we needed a central institution. So for instance, your land record database, the deed, we rely on the county recorder, right? So you need a trusted institution like a government or a corporation to control all the inputs and the changes to the database. And what the blockchain brings to the table is we don't need any centralized authority. Through these technological consensus mechanisms, we can make changes to everybody's copy of the database and make those changes almost impossible to undo. So when someone spends a Bitcoin, that is reflected in everybody's database, and no one person can change that record. The blockchain also addresses what's known as the double spending problem that had always plagued cryptocurrencies in the past. So if a currency is just data, it was always thought that there's no way you could keep people from infinitely propagating infinite amounts of data, so somebody could spend one Bitcoin over here and one Bitcoin over here, or keep spending the same Bitcoin infinite amounts of times. But thanks to the blockchain consensus mechanisms and cryptography, they've solved that problem and made it basically impossible to spend the same piece of cryptocurrency more than once. So I like to think of the blockchain as sort of infrastructure. It's kind of like plumbing. In the older days of the internet, when the internet was first around, we had the internet protocols like TCP/IP, which are the protocols that underlie the internet. And all these protocols really do is take little packets of data and make sure they get from point A to point B very reliably. And in the olden days, you couldn't do all that much with it other than send data. And alongside this infrastructure, people started layering more and more applications like HTTP, which allowed for web browsers and graphics, and internet streaming, streaming video. So I think the best way to think of the blockchain is kind of infrastructure that allows for these distributed, hard-to-tamper databases that people are now building applications on that benefit from a database that doesn't need a centralized authority and is hard to tamper with.
And not being either a lawyer or a computer scientist, I dropped computer science in college. I'm going to come at this from a somewhat different direction. I think that there's a side to these technologies that is less about the technology than we often hear, that it's also a kind of anthropology. And I appreciate the metaphors of my fellow speaker here about comparing these different technical models to actually economic theories. And part of what makes, say, Bitcoin or any other blockchain technology work is a set of technological innovations, math, cryptography, these sorts of things, Merkle trees, all sorts of terms we could throw out. But there's also a set of assumptions about human behavior in it as well. Part of what makes Bitcoin not break is the cryptography. Part of it is a certain set of assumptions about what people won't discard won't do to destroy the system. And then there's another set as we start exploring a new world of different kinds of cryptocurrencies. There's a really huge field of possibilities. A really huge field of possibilities of what can be built, what kind of rules can be inscribed in this. And this was something that I saw as a reporter covering some of the early development of especially the blockchain 2.0 space, the emergence of tools like Ethereum and colored coins and this whole range of options for expanding Bitcoin. You know, I first heard about Bitcoin from an Occupy Wall Street activist in 2012. You know, if I had been a better capitalist, I probably wouldn't need to be here right now, you know, especially this week. But I was, you know, I was kind of like, a new kind of money, who cares? And it was really only in early 2014 when I was traveling in San Francisco visiting some friends, and I was sat down by an old friend who was a kind of who had kind of come into this world, who was hanging out with Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, and said, look, there's something else that's going on. And one of the terms that he and his friend used was, this is an operating system for society. Right. This is a kind of palette that we can use to decide how we interact with each other. What rules govern our interactions, our transactions. And since then, I've spent time with a Catalan fugitive underground in Paris who was trying to use Bitcoin to create a new global financial system. With my friend Joel Dietz and his various efforts to create a kind of crypto equity crowdfunding model with people like Suzanne Tartowski-Tempelhoff, who's building a project called BitNation that's trying to replace the state with blockchain tools. In each of these cases, they were seeing a kind of a broad range of possibilities and an opportunity to rewrite rules in creative ways. Now, one of the things that's been striking, actually, is that in recent years, a lot of those people who thought a few years ago that they were taking down the big banks are now working for those same banks, right? There's something that's happened here where I think the sense of possibility, the sense of a kind of open anthropology has started to narrow, and sometimes it seems like, are we just replicating things that got regulated away for good reasons? Are we replicating? Are we really taking advantage of the opportunities of imagination that these tools afford? But one other question that I think is valuable to ask when thinking about what blockchain technologies is around trust. The term that is really used in a very technical, narrow sense by a lot of people in this space is trustless. It allows for trustless transactions. It allows for trustless contracts, which has a very specific meaning, but sometimes gets heard as saying there's no trust required whatsoever in the system. And I think it's more useful when comparing different kinds of blockchain tools and models to ask, where is the trust being shifted, right? In some cases, like over the course of the early life of Bitcoin, for instance, we saw breaches of trust, maybe not in the core technology, but certainly in the exchanges that got hacked, because they were poorly constructed. We've seen this in the early life of Ethereum as well, where the community had to make a trust decision about how they were going to deal with a major hack. So I find it often more useful as we design these tools not to imagine that we are going to eliminate trust from interactions, but that we are displacing and shifting trust, and that we should ask ourselves always, where is that trust going now, and is that better than where we started?
All right, that's terrific in terms of framing comments. I'd like to drill down and pick up on a couple things that were said. So Harry talked about blockchain as a form of enabling infrastructure on which interesting applications could be built. Nathan referenced a maybe more sweeping vision that this is a new operating system for society, which then in turn raises the same kind of question, what would be built on this new operating system? So first question for you, Eric. Maybe you talk a little bit specifically as to what the property applications could look like being built on this enabling infrastructure. And then I'd like to get some specific examples out there as to where you think this could potentially work and why.
Okay. And so the problems that Fernando de Soto has identified with property rights in developing countries they range from corruption to just simple sheer bureaucratic inefficiency. So in many places, the title to a particular piece of property is just a stack of moldering papers in a folder with conflicting legal claims for that particular piece of property in the local land office. And so effectively, he sees this problem, which is preventing people from getting an incentive to improve their homes, to transact on the market with the things that they already own, because unless you know someone personally, in many cases, you don't have certainty that what they're selling you that they truly own in a lot of developing countries. So he sees this as an immense hindrance to development around the world. We have comparatively reliable institutions, but are they perfect? Definitely not. They're a human devised system, so they'll generate error. But on top of that, why do we have title insurance? I mean, we can have a long debate about what it is providing, but it's based in the underlying notion that your title is not certain. So effectively, by encoding property information, who owns it, where it's located with, now we've got, GPS down to the square inch. So effectively, we can reliably know where property is and who owns it with a great degree of certainty.
Eric, let me interject though. It seems to me that you still have a problem defining the property rights in the first instance, right? To the extent that uncertainty exists today, where someone might be squatting on areas today.
Yep.
Blockchain's not going to solve that part of it.
And that's why I'm less sanguine about applications to real property than I am to smart contracts involving the automated transfer of digital assets when certain individuals have said, yes, this party completed their aspect of the contract, then it becomes almost perfectly automated, or in the case that no individual input is required, it can be a purely automated process. And so, but the problem with real property is when you're encoding something onto the blockchain, you're encoding it with finality. All future transactions are referring to the initial state of the world that you've encoded into that first block. So if your title is incredibly uncertain because it's just a pile of moldering papers in your local land office, you're sidestepping the really hard question, which is how do you resolve the conflicting claims to this property that in some cases go all the way back to colonial authorities in Africa. Ghana is an example of a country that's experimenting with this technology with a company called Bitland. So I think there's promise there, but real property, especially given the problems with real property that DeSoto has identified, I don't see that as tractable to the applications of blockchain until you settle questions with legal finality, because otherwise you're going to be having collateral attacks on the information that's encoded in blockchain. And so until we get rid of the need for title insurance entirely in our country, I don't know if real property is going to be the most promising application. But think of the amount of commerce that is now just the transmission of data, or the amount of business practices that rely on the reliable transmission of data. I think we already had a new social operating system when we discovered the digitization of information and a near costless means of transmitting that information. I see this as, that 2.0. Now we can make that information that's transmitted reliable, transparent, and effectively immutable to any participant on a particular network supported by a given blockchain.
That segues nicely into something that, Harry, I know you've been looking at. You'll hear about blockchain and automated contracts. Maybe just give us the layman's version. How does blockchain lead to automated contracts in the first instance?
Yes, this is a good question. So I think this is an example of getting at one of the other questions. To what degree is there hype around blockchain? To what degree is it overstated? And I personally think that while the blockchain really does have real innovations like cryptocurrency and it's enabled ICO, there's also a tremendous amount of hype, and I encourage you not to believe the hype. And so particularly I researched...
Your public enemy plea.
Right, yes. Yeah, don't believe the hype. Exactly. So I researched in the area of computable contracting and or automated contracting. And while I think the blockchain and cryptocurrencies do solve two problems in that area, if you really study the space, there's somewhere between, let's say 12 or 15 major problems that need to be solved, in my opinion, of which the blockchain solves two of them, right? So, so that's great, and I think it solves, for example, I think the ledgering problem and the secure exchange of value problem. But if you study the field, there's many other major problems, related to standards and interface and relation to real-world assets and titling and escrow and things like that that have not been solved.
So, for example, going back to the property example.
Right, that's a phenomenal example. Right. So you could have the ledgering and the transfer value portions of that system solved. But what about the dispute resolution and the linkage to real property and who's appending the database? Like all these problems need to be solved in parallel. But I think so in looking at projects like Ethereum, which I think is really interesting and does some really neat stuff, I think it is kind of overstated the degree at which it starts it solves the automated contracting problem. I think it solves little discrete parts. So automated contracting, computable contracting is sort of this idea that you can arbitrarily contract about arbitrary goods and services in a form that a computer could fully autonomously or partially autonomously execute, and all the ramifications of that contract would sort of autonomously take care of themselves on their own, such as money transfer and transfer of ownership and recording and notification and sensing, things of that nature. There's a lot more infrastructure needs to be done. So
that's actually super helpful. Just let me restate what I think I heard, which is, if you want to fulfill the vision, and we're here in a law school, this is an awful vision for me, to have everything automated and just completely that away. But in that apocalyptic world, blockchain solves two of the problems related to things that go into contracting or dispute resolution, notably the ledgering problem, the transfer of value problem, but you still have issues such as deleting the property rights in the first instance, dispute resolution, and we could probably identify 8 to 10 others that are still out there.
Correct.
Not automated.
Correct. So I think I think the internet itself is a good analogy to where the early days of the internet. So before we had streaming video, right, we just had little packets of data that could go from point A to point B. And it took a bunch of parallel developments and problems to be solved before we had Netflix. We had to have developments in video compression. We had to have advancements in broadband. We had advances in processors that could decompress videos. All these different parallel things had to be solved. So I think that we'll be having a different conversation in 30 years, or maybe even 15 years. But I think at this point we're still in early days, and we don't know which of these parallel problems are going to be solved.
Nathan, let me loop you in on that. So Netflix as the apotheosis of the use of the internet protocol. Okay? In contrast to going back to the days in which the internet protocol was going to result in super informed electorate, direct democracy, and sort of a Valhalla of a world that, as you alluded to before, today's world, the internet, it looks like a lot like the old world in many respects, right? As you think about the possibilities of blockchain, how could this really look different with respect to some of the social issues that you've studied? And then part B of that is, and do you think that'll work, or does this ultimately get co-opted by forces that look a lot like the old world?
Well, I appreciate so much the issues that you both have been raising, because they're about the world surrounding this technology, which actually I think impacts the technology more than we like to think. You know, the internet is a perfect case. It's a beautifully decentralized technology designed, you know, by scientists and defense engineers who wanted to create a system resilient to Soviet attacks. So packet switching is this decentralized structure. But we end up, because of the nature of certain investment patterns and business models, we end up with a highly centralized internet where 70% of traffic goes through Facebook and Google, right? And we see something, we've already seen the signs of something quite similar happening in Bitcoin. You know, the original idea seems to have been that lots of people would be able to participate in mining and thus the governance of the system. But you now end up in a moment where, because of certain technical innovations and means of gaming that system, mining and thus the governance of Bitcoin has become extremely centralized to a set of actors who I'm not sure I trust more than the Federal Reserve, right? And you know, I think often of one of the few consultants when I was first reporting on this stuff. I was trying to find someone reliable, darn it, because everybody who knew about Bitcoin had a bunch of it, right? So we couldn't trust anybody because they are all like, oh, it's the greatest thing ever. You know, write something nice about it. You know? he was, this, business consultant who, made a point of not having any Bitcoin, and he did a calculation of, one of the early great opportunities that people paraded around was that this was going to bring financial tools to the unbanked, right? Bring it to where the banks weren't going. And he calculated, right, how much it would cost in certain use cases to bring Bitcoin-based banking to the Amazon, right? And there you have immediately replaced all of those Western Union transaction costs and then some, right? The context, the technologies that interface between the core blockchain technologies and the users are often the hardest challenges. And that just this core technology, which in principle could solve certain social problems, I think in many cases has often exacerbated them because of inequalities of access that manifest themselves quite heavily to the point where, for instance, the Bitcoin economy is far more unequal than the offline economy, far more male and reinforcing a whole set of inequalities.
So let me just clarify what I heard you say, which is with respect to the vision of Bitcoin as a currency that would remove transaction costs, remove a Western Union that's taking outsized fees for the unbanked. That vision was naive insofar as the unbanked didn't have access to the technology resources that would require you to be able to avail yourself of the cryptocurrency, and so we need to be realistic as we're thinking about what the applications are.
That's right.
Okay. One final question in terms of a place where you think the blockchain mania has said, put a fair amount of hype around applications in an area, they're like, it's not going to work, and here's why. And I'll leave it here, and then we'll open up to the audience for a few questions before I break. Eric, what's one where it's not going to work, and here's why?
This will make a nice segue. Some of the ICOs that you see out there will not work.
ICO, initial coin offerings, we're going to be doing that in a second. Some of them are not going to work because
they're taking advantage of the mania surrounding cryptocurrencies. People see drastic price increases. They see somebody buying a Lamborghini who's 20 years old because they bought Bitcoins when they were 14. Effectively, that leads to a lot of people being like, I need to get in on the next big thing. Bitcoin's at 6,000, 8,000, 10,000. That ship has sailed. What's the next big thing? That creates an opportunity for people to put out a lot of, I think, promising ideas, but some of them are half-baked. I would say some of them are objectively fraudulent. Most of them, I think, are well-intentioned, but haven't been fully thought through. An initial coin offering is effectively a vote in a particular business idea based in a white paper surrounding that particular coin and what it's intending to do.
Let me drill down on that, which is, one interpretation of that is it's a tulip craze, it's a hula hoop craze, and because of that, it's just not going to be fulfilled. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the fit for technology as a way of getting a venture off the ground in itself is flawed. Which of the two are you saying? Is it a flaw in the technology as used for ICOs, or is it just it's a craze and it's out of control?
I think I don't think it's out of control. I think the level to which people have had immense success, especially in putting money into Bitcoin, has led to a level of interest where a lot of people don't understand the distinctions between all of these different coins. And so they see an initial coin offering and they just think, next Bitcoin. This one seems hyped. I read some comments on this Facebook page that said, get in now and you'll get these immense returns. Some of those statements are, I think, true. But I think a lot of them are just fundamentally unproven. And then if you have an environment where you're making a lot of promises based on the underlying technology that you haven't fully thought through the implications of, then effectively I think that creates an opportunity for fraudsters to get in and capitalize on that. One small point about the problems that have emerged in Bitcoin that Nathan alluded to, those are a direct result of the consensus method that an additional block is added to Bitcoin's blockchain. But a lot of these things don't emerge until you have a sufficient number of users on the network. So the comparative value of different consensus methods that underlie each of these blockchains, I think a lot of them are still unproven. Some of the ones I didn't even take time to list, they're just white papers, and they're just a theory for a different consensus method that might work better than the existing ones underlying these technologies. So I think a lot of them still need to have a lot more users loaded onto a particular blockchain before the weaknesses in its architecture are actually exposed.
So I'll layer onto that. So I think you can't talk about the blockchain, particularly cryptocurrencies, without referring to the mania that's going on. So as some of you know, just in 1 year, Bitcoin has gone from $700 to about $11,000, right? And just a couple years ago, it was much less than that. And this is going on in a lot of these cryptocurrencies. So certainly referring to the tulip mania, at least some of these so you can spawn endless cryptocurrencies out there. There's no limit to how many different ones you can spawn. But you need a whole infrastructure, and cryptocurrencies are only worth as much value as people endow it with. So some of these cryptocurrencies are certainly going to fail. Maybe not necessarily Bitcoin or Ethereum, but a lot of them are. And then, so I think we really have to think about the mania. To borrow the term of Robert Schiller, irrational exuberance. It reminds me a little bit of the dot-com days, particularly in the ICO space, where the initial coin offering, where you're seeing people are buying ICO tokens, not because, so basically they're buying, I don't want to say securities or shares in a startup.
We'll take that up on the next
panel.
panel.
We'll take it. But they're basically buying something in a startup company without even caring what the company does, with the prospect that the value of the currency will rise and they'll be able to flip it. So anytime you have people speculating based upon something that's totally disconnected from the underlying fundamental value of the proposition, that to me should concern us.
So I kid you not, my phone notification just came up with a Wall Street Journal piece, Bitcoin mania, even grandma wants a piece of the action. We'll be taking that up here shortly. Nathan, what's one application that you think it's not going to work, there's a real problem that we're not necessarily seeing right now, you're skeptical?
Well, I appreciate that you said earlier savvy, or you said grandpas in addition to grandma, because I hate all the trashing of grandmas of these sorts of conversations, right? My grandma was solid, and she could, she wasn't around in time, but she would. I think I appreciate what you said there. I think there's no greater lesson that I've experienced than spending a few hours reading through the threads of an early altcoin, Bitcoin clone pump and dump scheme. Right, watching as the founder and a bunch of fools built up the value of a new coin, and then the founder walks away and lets the thing explode. Right, the danger there is real, and I think it's really important. We haven't really talked about the regulatory context, but this is coming in hard, and it's gonna be increasingly important. It's important to recognize, on the one hand, ways in which certain regulations we have might be onerous and prevent kind of innovation that we might like to see. But on the other hand, some of the basic rationales for regulation that has been created in the non-blockchain economy.
Okay.
And
yeah, take you back to a point that you made before,
yeah.
Which is, and we're going to take the cryptocurrency discussion in the next one. But you alluded to blockchain as an interesting possibility with respect to voting, which is an application that, first of all, maybe you could make the case as to why it would enable a different type of voting mechanism, and then as you assess where the challenges are, what would have to be solved to make that vision a reality?
Okay, so the reason why that this is exciting for a lot of people interested in voting and distributed governance is that it introduces the possibility of removing the kind of central vote counter, right? Enables us to instead of, say, the transaction being recorded on a distributed blockchain, right, like Bitcoin, the vote gets recorded there. Every vote is confirmed cryptographically, and so, for instance, in a case where the central government can't be trusted to accurately count votes, this is an exciting.
Or even say the state of Florida.
Right, and then you ask the challenges of something like that. I think that the real challenges are about, oh, there are so many. One is that question of inclusion that came up earlier. Who has access to these kinds of tools? Another question is around scalability. And this is something that hasn't come up as well, and something that we need to note here, that a lot of these tools that have been built up, when I first, in 2014, when I saw Vitalik Buterin describing the early problems with Ethereum at the Bitcoin Center in New York City, and talked to them after, the thing that was plaguing him was scalability. How are we, the Ethereum system is not capable right now of replicating the transaction volume, say, of Visa. So there are major technical problems, and there are some really interesting emerging technical solutions. But again, I think the challenge that this all comes down to, about how the technology is designed, how it's implemented politically, socially, economically, is about where are we choosing to put the trust. How has Bitcoin shifted trust from a few crypto geeks to a bunch of miners around the world with server farms? And for a question like voting, that matters immensely. Who is governing the fate of these networks, right? And is that structure of accountability actually superior to 18th century representative democratic engines?
Really quickly interject. I don't know if the role for lawyers is going to vanish entirely, because what we're talking about is the rules governing a particular network and how that network validates new information that's added to it. And so I'm passionate about the study of rules writ large, and yes, I'm a lawyer. And so effectively, I think there will always be a role for people who are very cautiously consider the effects of rules and the unintended effects, the intended and unintended effects of the rules governing these networks. That's what the consensus method is, and that's why I'm basically probably focused on that, hopefully not to the detriment of your understanding. But
so let's take a couple of questions. We've got a tradition that students get the first question, so if there's a student that has one ready to go, Vince, go.
Yeah, so you guys discussed a little bit how Bitcoin is getting sort of centralized. There are 5 entities that sort of hash most of the Bitcoins. Do you personally think that proof of stake with Ethereum will help solve that? You repeat the question?
Yeah.
So that Bitcoin, there we go.
See how I do with it. All right, so it was alluded to that Bitcoin has become, in many respects, centralized in ways that maybe originally were not anticipated. The question is, does the Ethereum mode of doing consensus, which is proof of stake, is that right?
that's proposed. It's not yet in
That's what they're
That's
working
being
on.
proposed in Ethereum. Do we think, or do the panelists think, that that will solve that problem with respect to consensus? Harry, you want to take a swing
Well,
first?
I would just say, we don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but you can never know until you see how it plays out in the real world.
Well, so I can shift the question
Yes.
somewhat. So you also talked about now everyone who thought there was income banks works at the banks. So we're starting to see us moving into an age of big disruptors. Usually people disrupt are small and they change what big people do. But now moving into their big disruptors, just kind of a general, what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I guess one direction I see this going that I'm afraid of is we haven't been particularly effective in regulating our financial industry, in part because of the level of...
Can't hear you back there.
We haven't been able to actually, there's many instances where we have been unable to effectively regulate our financial industry, in part because of the level of influence that the financial industry exerts over the people who purport to regulate them. And so I fear for the possibility of regulation influenced by the existing big players in the financial industry to tilt the scales in their favor such that they can capture a lot of the gains that blockchain or cryptocurrencies hold out to the general public at large.
I would add too, one piece that we haven't talked about is, we've been running on the idea that consensus is the sole mechanism.
I think they're having trouble here in the back.
Oh, okay. There's also a series of projects. For instance, one is called HoloChain, that actually doesn't depend on consensus and decentralizes one step further. And in a sense, the metaphor is each person has their own ledger, and those ledgers interact with each other. So in a way, you could think of it as really creating a protocol for the exchange, putting the exchange under the umbrella, among currencies, under the umbrella of the currency itself and of the system. And I think that these kinds of models might be one way of addressing, of actually eliminating some of the problems of confirmation, proof of stake, proof of work that the consensus-based systems have required.
Just one quick follow-up too. One thing you alluded to, we haven't talked about, are private blockchains. We mostly refer to public blockchains. Anyone can join the Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum blockchain, but a lot of consortiums like R3, companies are forming private blockchains. It's possible we could go down a world of walled gardens where, you know, fairly trusted or large corporations have their own well-managed private blockchains that people use the same way we use Facebook or Google or Apple.
And those would require much less stake.
Right.
Those are known in the literature as
So we've got, I'm
permissionless
going
or
to take two more
permissionless
questions before we go.
blockchains.
You and then Jackie. Yeah.
I have a sort of philosophical question. It seems like you talked about trustless blockchains and trustless. I'm thinking about truth, and there's this concept that law is like dispute resolution, right? And that's two different truths. And people are talking about blockchains like they'll maybe uncover this universal truth, and do you believe in that? Does that exist? That Nathan just spoke about. Different people have their own blockchains with their own information.
It's a great question, so let me make sure that everyone
Right.
can hear it, which is, as a philosophical matter, the idea that there's one right answer or one right record is an interesting belief that in some respects is different than the view that there might be multiple truths out there in the world. Is that true in terms of an assumption of blockchain technology, that philosophically it is committed that with respect to certain records, there is one clear truth?
Is there one clear bank balance for you? I mean, the immediate applications that we're describing to me strain the underlying relativistic understandings we have of our reality, which that's an important point. At some point we're approaching, yes, I don't think everything will be put on a blockchain. I've seen people saying, we just need to tokenize the ocean through an ICO and pollution will go away. And I was like, but before what authority are you going to raise a claim for pollution if a non-member of your tokenized ocean decides to dump something in it? So I think it's an important question, but the type of things we're talking about are things that are reasonably well identified and accepted as operating as truth, whether or not the underlying truth is as firm as we might like it to be.
I think it's a really important question. You know, and Vital, in one of my early conversations with Vitalik Buterin, right, he made clear, to get a little metaphysical for a second, that he sees the universe as a computer, right? And so he sees Ethereum, smart contracts, as kind of a subset of the universe computer in which everything is a kind of binary, you know. And I think a manifestation of this has been in the early life of Ethereum, right? There was a big hack where millions of dollars worth of Ethereum were stolen from a thing called the DAO, and the hack took advantage of a bug in the code, right? So the community was faced with a problem. Do we accept the code? You know, again, this is trying to operate without, you know, a legal system, right? If the bug is in the code and the hacker took the money, the hacker gets the money, right? That's the truth. Because the truth is in the code. It's shifting the truth to the code. The community in that case decided to fork and choose another way. But that whole case, I think, points to the value sometimes in a legal system of having a human being who is capable of evaluating gray area and of having a kind of diverse range of opportunities before them. I think there are real dangers when we put more and more decision-making power in lines of code rather than in kind of contextual decision-making.
Great question. Jackie?
Can I just add real quick? I also think that's a great point. And one thing, back to the point of people overstating things, I think you can know certain things on the blockchain pretty well. Like one thing you can know pretty well is that somebody has the key to unscramble stuff that has been scrambled. And you can know that with very high level of certainty mathematically that they have. But just because you can know some things about the blockchain with certainty, people conflate that and think that you can represent arbitrary things on the blockchain, and that can be totally unlinked to the world at large. So we need to be careful about what we do know fairly certainly, and what is sort of can be represented there, but we don't have any truth guarantee.
Jacqueline.
I think you mean Liz.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Can you talk to kind of the efficacy of blockchain as it relates to privacy management? So consent management as it relates to GDPR, e-privacy in Europe, clinical trials or healthcare data sharing. Is that something you looked
So the
at?
question is, at the intersection of blockchain and privacy matters, such as, say, applications in health and medical, what does this look like?
As well as consumer, right? You have to track this consent and pass it along in the new European world. How, is this a technology that can achieve that?
Great question. Harry, you want to take it?
Oh yeah, I'll just make a quick. One thing that the blockchain allows you to do is hide private data in plain sight, which I think is interesting. You can encrypt data, put it out there, and ensure that the same encrypted data is everywhere, yet you can't easily decrypt it.
There's
So
no target to have.
yeah, right. So I think it's
Well, that's a time-dependent issue. So the longer it persists
Right.
in plain sight, the easier it becomes to decrypt. And at
Right.
some point in time, it's decrypted automatically. Right?
Yes.
I mean, you're gonna have things exposed via quantum computation here extremely rapidly, right? And so this notion that you can hide it in plain, you can hide for long periods of time things in plain sight is specious, right? You can hide things for a little bit of time in plain sight. Afterwards, there's no hiding.
And that's precisely why you see a lot of different companies investing in permission blockchains, private blockchains, where the authority to determine who can even be a user, let alone a participant that can add blocks to that particular chain, that's all still very centralized, where the company says, you're an authorized user, put in your, your identifying information, and you can then see the information. Until then, it's as private as any data that's out there, although in a world of quantum computing, I hope our ability to develop post-quantum cryptography outmatches our ability to develop quantum computing.
Your ability to erase what's already out there needs to be even better than all the rest of that stuff,
We
which
have
is not clear.
reached the technical boundaries of my imagination. So it's time to take a break. We're going to take 10 minutes. We'll reconvene a little bit after 6:45. Restrooms are far down on the end of the left. Out in the hallway, we've got some cookies and some snacks. See you in 10 minutes. And please help me thank you. This is a great panel. Number two, we're going to talk about one particular application of blockchain, in particular cryptocurrency, and some of the dynamics around initial coin offerings, as well as hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about SAPs as well in terms of future tokens if we get a chance. Great panel that we've got put together. Again, I'll direct you to the bios, except for Caleb, who is a late addition. So, by way of introduction, make sure I've got names. Harlan Williams is an attorney over at Cooley and has been studying and working on issues related to ICOs and cryptocurrency. Thanks for being here. Caleb, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Caleb Slade. I'm a co-founder of a company in Denver called Salt Lending. We are offering blockchain-backed loans. You can use your Bitcoin or Ethereum as collateral for a cash loan.
And Emma Channing is to his left. And in fact, you guys worked together in connection with an ICO. How long ago?
Firstly, it was a membership sale.
Membership sale.
Appreciate it.
Secondly, it was a private membership sale. Thirdly, it was in June, July, and August of this year.
You did a transaction together in June, July, and August of this year. And in terms of Emma's expertise in this area, there's about 3 or 4 people in the room who said, oh, Emma's speaking, I want to be there. And so I'm really grateful to have you here. Emma, why don't you take the framing conversation, and then we'll roll in to a panel discussion. Emma, take it away.
Who in the room has heard of an ICO? Seen an ICO? Okay, see you. No, whatever. I'm formerly the CEO and General Counsel of the Algorithm Group. We have just reformed as the Status Group. Welcome to the joys of startup life. We're plagued by the same problems. We run ICOs, but we run very specific types of ICOs. So Salt is a very classic client of ours in that they are an established team with a very strong advisory board. They had a minimum viable product when we started working with them. They had a very clear use of proceeds. And we are very careful about the projects that we take on, the quality, the state of the company. We are particularly concerned about retail investors within the ICO space, and it's an ongoing discussion amongst a lot of people who work in it, but we don't think ICOs are for two guys and a bit of paper. That does not make me very popular, but we think the VCs are going to still be around to do seed investing and a stage baby B. Where we think ICOs really come into their own is where you have an established company. It doesn't need a lot of oversight. It shouldn't have to have a lot of oversight. And that's where a token structure makes a lot more sense, where it's giving very, very little rights to the token holders in return for the cash. We've always viewed ICOs as maturing into something like high yield debt in a way that public companies can raise with very, very few covenants, large sums pretty quickly. So my job is to kind of talk you through the market and kind of get into some of the detail of how it's changed and why it's changing. So in 2016, we saw 256 million raised across 43 ICOs. Average size was 6 million. Total VC raised in 2016 was 500 million. That was static to this year. This data is a little out of date, so I'm going to look at this one. But 2017 has essentially blown 2016 out of the water from an ICO perspective. There have been 228 ICOs to date. Venture capitals passed in June. ICOs raised 1.5 billion in June and July of this year alone. There is one particular ICO which some of you will be familiar with called EOS. EOS is heading for a market cap of 10 billion by the time they're finished. So this is at one level a complete sea change. In 2017. So in 2016, some of the big projects were raising 10, 12 million. In 2017, we had Filecoin at 275 million. Tezos, and incidentally, all they did wrong was trust Swiss law firm. Anyone wants a conversation about Swiss law firms? That's me. They raised 232 million. EOS Stage 1 alone raised 185 million. So the top end of the market, it's got very, very chunky. But average size actually this year is still only 12 million. And it's one of the misunderstandings a lot of people in the market and a lot of people looking to raise ICOs, we find, come to us and go, we want to raise 50, we want to raise 100 million. Raising 50, 100 million is actually very, very hard. If you're raising a protocol, or if you are raising something like Salt, which people genuinely want to use, are going to use, see the point of using. So for people not familiar with Salt, Salt is a secured crypto lending facility. So you can deposit 125% of crypto of the fiat that you want to borrow down, which enables you to stay long on your crypto and have access to fiat, and also avoid other such nasties as tax crystallization. We genuinely believe that SALT funding, as and when they get up and running, which will be for the end of the year, is going to change the market and change the way that cryptocurrency trades. Because everyone who is doing ICOs will no longer need to immediately convert their crypto. And that's the kind of project we do like to get behind. But as I say, we've seen a lot of changes this year. So in April of this year, people were raising with white papers that made me want to scream, with massive disclaimers that made not a lot of sense. Quite often they were raising without a white paper out. We raised BCAP with the offering memorandum only being available a week before the sale. Come August, September of this year, people expect to see the white paper at least a month before the sale. If it is a not-up protocol, particularly if it's a commercial product, if you do not have commercial tie-ups, particularly by this fall, you will not raise. People have got a lot more discerning. There is also a lot of fatigue in the market. A lot of the VCs that we know who invest in ICOs are shut down for the year. And they shut down about 2 weeks ago. It was a combination of deal fatigue, having made an enormous amount of money and not wanting to blow it, and the forks. So for those of you not familiar, Bitcoin and Ethereum went through a couple of forks. And because Bitcoin Cash made people such an extraordinary amount of money over the summer, that made for some odd mechanics. So most of our clients right now are pushed out to Q1 or Q2 of next year. And we are just waiting for the market to turn, the VCs to close their books. And that's roughly where we see the market at the moment.
Thank you. I want to start with some stupid questions. And then we'll hopefully get to something that's maybe a little bit less stupid. But let me conceptualize ICOs and ask how you guys think about this. So in some respects, you talk about funding a protocol. So this is a method of fundraising. Second, it is a currency. And third, the nature of entity has a lot of variety in this world, right? So sometimes there is a company, and sometimes it's just a decentralized network that's building the product. Let me start with, in terms of those three aspects of what's going on in the ICO, is that how you conceptualize it? And if not, how do you see it differently? Okay, let me go start with you.
Yeah, I think there's as many differences in characteristics between one ICO and another ICO as there are like cars. You know, I think there's some characteristics that are similar. I think there's some characteristics that are very different. Some tokens behave like a currency, some tokens don't. Some tokens act as a vital utility for that protocol to operate, and it can't operate without it. Some are tacked on after the fact. Sometimes some companies are using this solely as a fundraising mechanism that is disruptive, and you don't have to give up equity to VCs. But a lot of companies see this as a really great opportunity to not only raise funds or bring in funds pre-launch, but also as a customer acquisition tool and a way to engage with your future customers before you've launched, and to start that relationship and get them engaged. I think that's the biggest power of this tokenized fundraising model, is that instead of just taking money from a select group of a boardroom that you pitch to and take a whole bunch of your money and take a board seat, or a bunch of your equity and take a board seat, now you're democratizing that, and you are engaging with the people who are actually going to be your customers right out of the gate.
Let's go back to the notion of funding a protocol. Let's go back to talking to Grandpa. How do you explain to Grandpa, we are funding a protocol? Emily, you want to take that?
Sure. So what is true for last year is true for this year. What has always raised extremely well are what we call protocol tokens, which are tokens that are designing a system. EOS is an extreme example because they've got about 600 different ideas of exactly what protocols they are going to produce. They haven't produced any of them yet. That's kind of a movable feast, which we all watch with interest. Other protocols like Numerai, which help hedge funds source ideas and reward people is an example of a well-built-out protocol. Why protocols sell? Technically, God knows. We're not really sure, but a lot of this is the cryptocurrency. The people who invest in ICOs are divided into three groups. These are cryptocurrency whales who are often gamers and or poker players. They were early adopters. They bought and or mined 2009 through 2011. And they, we suspect, control something in the region of 60 billion, equivalent USD, in Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Ethereum. You've then got the VCs who've moved quickly. VCs actually had to change their investment docs to be able to invest in ICOs. One of the ways we had a huge number of VCs come into Civic in the summer, and one of the ways that we cut them back was like, show me the clause in your investment docs that allows you to invest in this. And I was like, oops, bye-bye, off with you.
Let me back up for a second. So VCs are playing by and large with other people's money. Yeah, there's a little bit of theirs in it as well. And they have agreements called limited partnership agreements where they say, here's how I'm going to use your money. One of them prohibits investment in things that are not going to be equity. That is an ownership stake in the company. And with ICOs, by and large, you're not getting an equity ownership stake of the company.
You will
correct?
Almost never. So I belong to a regulatory think tank with some amazing people from all over the world. And one of the things that amuses me endlessly about this think tank is the one type of token that we cannot, as a group, define is what we would call a security for purposes of US law. You cannot, from a global perspective, get all the lawyers to line up. Because particularly in the civil law jurisdictions, they're very keen on what's the counterpart. But generally speaking, in the US, we refer to a security token as a token that promises a return of some form. There is a very dull and 30-year-long list of cases called the Howey test, which you really don't want me to go into, which defines an investment contract and what is a security token. There's then several others. We generally kind of refer, I tend to call them app tokens because it makes more sense to founders. Another term for that is platform access token, and SALT is a very good example. The SALT token gives you access to the SALT lending platform. There are tiers within that. If you have one SALT token membership for the year, you get X benefits. If you have 30, you get another tier of benefits. And that's a very standard sort of app token. You do get what we call freemium donation tokens. Ethereum is the prime example of that. Tezos also was purely a donation. And you do see tokens structured that way. We think that's actually horrible from a tax perspective, but in fact, first of all, whenever anyone thinks about doing an ICO, actually the first question you should be asking is the tax. So that's kind of the range of tokens, but even a security token, we've designed all the security tokens that have gone to market. They are described as a fractional, non-voting, economic ownership in the underlying asset, i.e. no rights at all, not even a little bit. And app tokens, the only right is to access the platform, that's it.
So you mentioned two.
Rick, hang on for a second. I want to make sure they're a little bit caught. We'll come back in a second. Carlin, in terms of, give us a sense of the type of clients that you're working with in the crypto world.
Yes, we're predominantly working with a technology company that decides they want to build a network using some type of blockchain, so maybe on top of like the Ethereum network. And they're going to have some type of product that then consumers can use these tokens, and these are more of the app token, like Emma just mentioned, that have some type of utility associated with them that they can then want to hold those and use those on the network and then access some feature of the network. For example, it could unlock special features, or actually it's the only way you could actually use the product.
Okay, so two different aspects I wanted to drill down on. First is what Emma alluded to, which is, can you talk a little bit about she said there's virtually no control rights for a backer who purchases the tokens. Maybe you talk about how that looks different than the control rights of a traditional investment and some notable differences there.
Yeah, sure. So again, looking at the app token idea, and so you're buying a utility token, something you're actually going to use on the product. It doesn't give you ownership rights over the company, and your only economic return would be to sell the token on the secondary market. Your economic return would be based on market influence of that price. That differs from a traditional equity investment where you're more than likely buying some type of ownership stake in the company, and your future economic success is dependent on the company's success.
Okay, so as an investor, the investor is going to get tokens or coins instead of, say, shares in the company. No governance rights in terms of voting, not going to be typically taking a board seat if there is a board to begin with, right? So some very different characteristics there. In terms of the currency itself, it often feels to me kind of like a gift card. That is a gift card specific to the entity that's offering the tokens. Is that a way that you guys think about this? Maybe Caleb, you could jump in on this.
Yeah, I mean, it has some of the characteristics of a gift card, I would say, but it also has some unique characteristics that blockchain assets enable. In particular, fungibility. So like one utility token is the same value as another utility token. Exchangeability, digital exchangeability of these assets is really vital to their usefulness, I would say, and that's kind of different than it's very difficult. You can't transfer your gift card to somebody in Mongolia very easily with an internet connection without a trusted intermediary party. And one of the things that blockchain assets and blockchain technology enables is this very frictionless transactional experience or relationship between you and a market. But yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, again, like I said, it depends on each individual token or utility token or access token, or whatever you want to call it.
So let's make this specific to SALT. So in layman's terms, the SALT business model, Emma alluded to a little bit. What do you guys do?
So SALT is like SALT, S-A-L-T, that you can buy on secondary exchanges, you can buy from us. It is a consumptive use product that is used to purchase access to our lending platform and is used to purchase any of the products and services SALT provides. It can also be used.
So if I have a SALT token, I get access to your platform. And what's on the platform that I would want?
So let's say you have a couple Bitcoins and you want to borrow $10,000 in cash. You don't want to sell your Bitcoins. You don't want capital gains. You don't want to lose out on future appreciation. Then you would need one SALT to come to the platform and redeem it. And we take that from you. You don't get it's a consumed. You redeem it on the platform, and that gives you access to that $10,000 loan, which is still collateralized by Bitcoin. But what we've done is we've taken a traditional lending model, which is asset-backed lending, is a very traditional lending model. We've taken all the origination fees, maintenance fees, all these other little fees that get added as a cost of money, and we've just wrapped it up into this ERC20 blockchain asset called SALT.
If you're at liberty to say, how much money did you guys raise through it was not an ICO, but through the offering?
No, I
cannot say.
I'm not.
Okay. Was the money that you raised used to build out the product itself?
It is used to continue to continue and wrap up the production that is already in process. We did a small equity round, a traditional seed fund, to get everything going, and get the technology starting and build that. But we really our cost of one of the biggest operational costs we face is jurisdictional regulatory compliance. Being a financial product and kind of making our own path with a new sort of lending model or lending against a new sort of asset, it's remarkably expensive when there's not like a chapter in the book that you get to follow. You have to work with regulators and very expensively so to find that path forward.
All right, let's fork this discussion. First,
are you a financial institution?
We're on the broker-dealer path.
So if we talk about three different dimensions, first of all, where do use of blockchain offerings as a fundraising mechanism fit into the existing fundraising landscape for companies first, and then let's take the legal issues second. So on the first, Emma, you said, if I heard you in the introduction, that you think that there's still going to be a role for traditional seed investment, traditional VC Series A?
Maybe B.
Okay, and the idea being that at those stages, it's just too speculative, too much uncertainty, that the traditional methods are superior to
I mean, I think
crypto.
we've been seeing a sea change in startups over the last 10 years. What is a B round now is what would have probably been a D or E round, 4 or 5 years ago. Increasingly, as you have serial successful entrepreneurs who are bootstrapping, this whole kind of thing is changing. But let me frame this from how this goes wrong, and then come back to why we think this is appropriate. The SEC's has been incredibly clear about ICOs, and the crypto community, generally speaking, keeps on looking for some kind of Bible on how the SEC is going to treat ICOs, and I can promise you that is not coming down. There is 30 years of case law on this area, but they have been very clear about a few things. Firstly, they are not interested in protecting accredited investors. If you're doing a security token Reg D offering, they are not going to come take a look. They consider accredited investors big enough and not good enough to look after themselves. A massive source of debate within the crypto community is whether it is fair that the accredited investor test is an income and asset test as opposed to an investor and experience test, because it's very hard for people with crypto assets to meet these tests. The next thing they've been very clear about is they are there to protect retail investors. The next thing they have been very clear about is that they are not going to come just after breaches of securities law. They're going to come after breaches of securities law where there was a massive loss of retail money. Not mentioning then that maybe blowing through half your ether in 2 weeks, that might possibly count as not particularly good use of capital. So these are the kind of projects that have huge regulatory risk. And so one of the reasons why, because ICOs sit on this hair trigger within securities laws, we recommend, and we have clients who come to us who are at the sort of C stage, and we're just like, we have VCs we partner with, and we're like, go take VC money, get the guidance, get the help, get the oversight, because there is a use to that for early stage, even for serial successful investors. There is a use to having experienced investors coming in, giving you connections, giving you oversight, making sure you do actually do your accounts and so on. But yeah, we see a role for ICOs kind of when that company is established, when it has a team, when it has a minimum viable product, ideally when it has revenue and profit.
Carlin, is that what you're seeing as well in terms of use of ICOs as a fundraising mechanism? And so just to put some numbers behind this, let's say you do a $500,000 seed round, gets the company to something on the order of a minimum viable product or possibly something in the market, do a Series A, call it $5 million, and then maybe a $10 million Series B, and at that point there's something out there and you see the use of ICOs, or are you seeing different uses in terms of fundraising?
We're seeing it slightly different, although I will agree it's very expensive to do an ICO because you have structural concerns right from the beginning. As Emma mentioned, tax is a huge driver, and so you have to think about how are you going to set up your company? Is it going to be a U.S. corporation? Are you going to try and do it offshore? Doing it properly offshore is extremely expensive, but token sales are taxable, whereas sale of equity is not, and so you need to make sure that you have that set up from the beginning. You're also subject to a lot of different regulatory regimes, and you need to make sure you're compliant with all of those. And so you're going to have greater startup costs than you would just doing a traditional seed financing. And so we are seeing companies, though, that are looking to do some type of small equity round or do a seed round with the staff, which we can get to, and then do an ICO as their first real raise. But one of the arguments, too, for making, or at least having a better argument that your coin is a utility token and not a security, is whether or not you have an actual functional product, which takes capital as well. And so,
let's do SAFT while we're on the topic. So what is a SAFT?
So SAFT is akin to a SAFE, if anyone's familiar with the Y Combinator instrument, the simple agreement for future equity. It's a simple agreement for future tokens. It operates in much the same way. It would be an offering of a security, and so you would follow the protocol of doing any other type of Reg D offering. Sell to accredited investors and provide the appropriate memorandum and stuff like that, make a security filing if needed. And then that instrument would be a forward contract that would turn into tokens once you had your product up and available and actually had the tokens to sell in your ICO at some type of discount to the early investors.
All right, so let me baseline for those of you who may not know what a safe is. The idea is this: a company's raising money, and it's so early, we don't even know what the valuation of the company is going to be, but I know that I want to make an investment in the company. And so let's say I give that company $100,000 as part of a safe. I give them the money to use today, but I don't own equity. It's a simple agreement for future equity. And then if that company raises a significant round of money, qualified financing later, say $1 million, my $100,000 will convert alongside that additional $1 million at that valuation. All right, so the key point here is with a safe, we're talking about an instrument where the investor does not own anything yet, but there's an anticipation of ownership in the future. Now, a SAF is a closely mimicking version of that, except that the conversion will be into future tokens, right? And investors are essentially saying, yes, this is a security. The issuers are saying this is security, and so they're being governed by the same regulatory exemptions as safes and other early stage financing, right?
Yeah, exactly, but it gives the companies the opportunity to get initial capital in the door and actually then develop the network.
Okay, let me put this out to all of you, which is, it feels to me like the major difference, or one of the major differences, maybe twofold. First of all, no governance rights for the financial backer along the way in connection with an ICO. Yes?
Correct.
Okay. And two, in terms of the exit horizon for the investor, an equity investor by and large has to ride along until a company-wide liquidity event. Now you could trade on the secondary markets here and there, but this is different where a token is going to be tradable and you're not going to wait until a company-wide or an entity-wide exit event, correct?
Correct. This is where the securities law analysis gets very complicated and you have to be very careful in your white paper. So anyone who's close to markets will tell you the cryptocurrency markets, and in particular pop shortly after the draw date on an ICO, is a deeply murky space. What you have to be very careful about is that there is a whole series of cases, like 50 of them, stemming from a couple of cases, both of which said, basically, if you promise an extravagant profit, then that is de facto a security. It's an investment contract. They don't get into the nitty-gritty about the rest of the analysis. They just go, extravagant profit, promise, tick, security. And so what we've seen very recently is a blizzard of subpoenas coming out from the SEC. And in particular, if the white paper was sloppily written, was promising the exchanges that the token would be listed on, was promising price trajectory on those exchanges, then the SEC has hit them with a subpoena. And I think we can all expect to see increasing activity from the SEC about any app token that promises significant returns on the secondary markets.
Caleb, and I understand you guys did not do an ICO, but do people have tokens to use SALT?
Yeah, so people who purchased during our membership sale.
So is there ways that you have concern that a token holder's interests could get misaligned with yours? So for example, that they are going to be trading the tokens in a way before you guys are ready for that, or potentially that as we start to see derivative markets based on the underlying tokens, that we're going to be selling it short. What sort of uncertainties does this introduce for your company that you're worried about?
So SALT, we know there's a secondary market. We know that the SALT, membership it's built on the ERC-20 and it's tradable. But we have been very careful to, both in the lead up and the discounted membership sale, And as we sell memberships still before launch, we don't base any of our business decisions or our messaging or any of our interaction based off the secondary market, right? So once somebody purchases salt from us, we give it to them, and what they do with it is we can't control that. We also were very meticulous and painfully so to be very careful to not create an expectation of profit, and to even if somebody has said, I would like to invest in salt, we would correct them and say, this is not an investment. You are purchasing access to this product, and you should only purchase what you think you're going to want to use with salt. Now, some people ignored us. You know, some people bought a lot more than they thought they were going to use. But we were very careful to create that value and expectation. And I think that, like what Emma said is really important, is that you could sell a can of Coke, and if you say this, you'll be able to sell this can of Coke for $10 more tomorrow, that creates that expectation of profit, and that can of Coke can become a security, I think, in a lot of ways, as far as regulators are concerned. So the importance of creating the right expectations and being consistent about that was paramount for us as a company.
An example of how that can get problematic with the ongoing communication, because we run this through Telegram channels. And, we had one particular salt well. He, in fairness, was not pumping the price. He was just bored. It happens. There's a lot of very, very wealthy crypto wells out there, and they sit there and they don't have a lot to do other than peck around and do things like, it was a Monday morning, I was in New York, and all of a sudden the Salt Telegram channel is full of rumors that Salt is going to implement a unicorn fence. And we had
So what is a Salt Telegram channel for? I've got a certain image, but I suspect it's not right. What is a Telegram channel?
Telegram is a very ubiquitously used in the crypto community messaging app,
okay,
for mobile and desktop that has some capabilities that make it really easy to have a strong, big community.
Got it. So this is community talking, and the rumor is a unicorn fence. And what's a unicorn fence?
Completely made up. Completely made up, along with graphics, along with backstory, along with fake media stories. We got trolled for 3 weeks with this.
We still get trolled.
We still get trolled with it.
Somebody put a unicorn fence up today.
Yeah, and it's just like, and the problem is again this interplay between there's a lot of information asymmetries, and you've got these retail people who are like, what's that? And you know, that's pumping the price, and they panic, and this is the kind of disalignment that you can get between token holders and the issuer. And we just like troll. We can't, our teams, we come up with everything we possibly can to shut this rumor down. But no, this is now 2 months later, it's still alive and kicking.
So you couldn't take all those unicorns that you caught and sell them back?
Carl, unicorns are consumptive use products. Thank you very much.
Carl, let's come back to the regulatory gauntlet. So maybe you can take a use case of a client that comes to you and says, I'm interested in doing an ICO. What does the regulatory landscape look like here? What sort of traps have to be run outside of securities law in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. You have the tax concerns, as we mentioned, and then also money transfer laws, bank secrecy laws, making sure anti-money laundering laws. And so you have to make sure that you're complying with, you have to make sure you're complying with all of that depending on how your network will be operating, whether or not you're going to be taking currencies and transferring those into other forms of currencies, then you're going to have money transfer issues, and then, like I said, the tax issues as well.
Interesting. All right, let's open up for questions. And again, we'll take a student question first. Yep.
So one of the big criticisms, I think, of VC is that it kind of locks out average investors from the huge returns that you can see from companies, especially as IPOs are becoming less common. And I'm wondering if you see any room in ICOs for opening that back up to average investors in some way, or is it really just a matter of how the SEC comes down on it, and if they are really concerned about protecting the retail investors, that's just not going to be possible.
Okay, so let me repeat this. So the question is, and you alluded to accredited investors earlier,
Yep.
which in the United States, by and large, if you're rich and sophisticated, you're accredited. And if you're not, it can be problematic to get into early stage companies. That's a gloss that does violence to our securities law class here at the law school, but it's good enough for now, right? And so the question is, if you're an average Joe or an average Jill, and you want to get into an early stage startup that's hot, the accredited investor rules, by and large, are going to keep you out. Does this democratize opportunities to get into company or products at a value creation point?
Yes, it does. The question is, should it? And this, in one of the sales that we ran, we had a little old lady in the Telegram channel. She was very active. Yeah, it was sold. She bought salt on the way to choir. She persuaded her whole family to buy on the way to choir. She did not read the white paper. We told her to read the white paper a lot of times. She did not. She didn't understand the products. And, you know, so yes, I think it's, on the one hand, we strongly believe in ICOs. We believe they're here to stay. We believe we are a founder-led company, and we think founders should be able to raise money in the way that public companies have been able to raise high-yield debt for a long time. Yes, I believe in also the democratization of investment. I am very concerned about the level of retail investment and to the moon and the expectation of somewhere between 20 and 100x returns and all of this kind of thing that's going on in the market. And we're going to see the FTC come in as well as the SEC. The idea that this current, one of the things that people tell me is this is not a regulated space. Ha ha ha. Yes, it is. Highly regulated. Whether it's a security taken or an app taken. It's just we have not seen that much enforcement. That will change.
And I'll add another, I'm going to ask the same question for you guys. In terms of the FTC versus the SEC, so the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States is the regulatory entity that superintends the sale of securities, that is, instruments with expectation of profit. The FTC is about consumer protection and products. And to the extent that that's how this is conceptualized, the FTC would take jurisdictional look at this. So I have that right? Yeah. Do you guys have anything else you wanted to say in response to that question?
Personally, I believe in decentralization. I believe in disintermediation as well. I think that it is going to be, what we're going to look at as 2008 is the start of the era of distributed and decentralized systems as a new paradigm, and I think that funding is no exception to that. And I think that there's certainly responsibility, and I think that there's some companies that have gone about this and seen this as a cash grab, and they've sold snake oil. They've sold things to consumers that, you know, maybe believe the promises without the due diligence that should have been there of a sophisticated investor. At the same time, I think that people, whether they're wealthy or not, are smarter than they're given credit for. And I think that, you know, without getting political, I don't want to get at all, but I think that we haven't seen yet how much this is going to disrupt the funding model. Not only how companies are funded, but how individuals are engaged in a relationship with the companies that they use and how they do that. I think that we could very easily see a world in the near future where, at least technologically, it would be possible that every time you go to a Burger King and buy a burger, that you are actually buying a burger, but also a fractional ownership of that company. That's something that blockchain enables. Now, I think the regulatory framework is obviously, it usually takes some time to catch up to new technology, so I don't know where that's going to be, but I think that generally speaking, decentralization is something that can have a positive impact on both consumers and businesses.
Rick, I put your question on hold earlier. Coming back to it.
I was just going to ask you to mention the third investor, the third entity that does these investments. You had said.
Cryptos, VCs, and family offices, and those can quite often be the same thing. And there's a lot of advisory shops in this space. We are the most conservative by any long way. But one of the things we will tell you is that the whales are very, very close to the family offices and the VCs, if not working for them. You lose one whale, piss one of them off, you're in trouble. You lose 3, you're dead. Stone cold dead.
And whales are among the cryptos
Yes.
category? So these are big crypto traders that are influencers throughout the system,
They're
is
not
that
so
it?
much traders, they're investors. They are people who invested early and are sat on a lot of Bitcoin and Ether. We talk to about 40 of them on a daily basis to do our job well.
Wow,
So
in
you'll
a
also
massively decentralized world, there's 40 people who are wildly influencing the fate of these investments. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
shit.
They're do you know the concept of like Instagram? There's like these tastemakers or influencers, right? That peddle influence. It is more succinct and more precise and more measurable in the crypto space than anything I think I've ever seen. It is if you really just get the ire of some of these, and they are more sophisticated than most people give them credit for because they fly under this radar, right? They're not out there in like 3-piece suits driving Bentleys and like, you know, flashing their wealth, but they're richer than everybody in this room combined, probably. A lot of these guys, like we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets, but they're the reason they're so influential, yeah, billions in some cases. The reason they're so influential is because they're not influential because of the money they have. They're influential because of their mind and because of the things they say and their analysis, and they're trusted by a lot of people in the community. You really, it's amazing how quick the tide can turn on you.
And
So
what's more that I just want to make a point. Sorry, but one of the reasons why we run the Telegram channels early on, and one of the reasons why I'm heavily involved in that, and everyone always asks why the hell is your CEO doing that, is because the difference between an angry crypto whale and a troll is almost impossible to discern unless you have been deep. I've got 250 billion worth of M&A and cap markets experience for 20 years. I have been online gaming and coding since I was 7. And that half of my life is far more important to running a successful ICO, because the key is to get hold of the angry whale, get them to talk to someone in management and find out what they're upset about. Because they, forgive me, but they have a limited emotional vocabulary very often. And they're not great explaining, and they're passionate about it. They're passionate about the idea. And as I say, the difference for every one troll, we have 2 crypto whales who are just upset about a concept. And the trick is to introduce them to the management sources out. But you try to run this yourself. You try to run this without someone who's actually done this before, and you will end up with death threats.
Micah.
So you sort of alluded to like financial crimes enforcement network, the money transmission piece, and I think we've been focusing a lot on securities. At least on the banking side, we tend to see a lot of what I would call forum shopping or charter shopping that would occur when you have one regulator that you get pissed off at, and you switch to another one where you think you're all doing better. And can you talk about whether or not that's happening now in the crypto space vis-a-vis the CFTC, some of the offshore jurisdictions, anything along those lines? I mean, is there sort of what I would describe as a race to the bottom along the lines of what you get in Delaware or South Dakota when it comes to Bitcoin in terms of what you're trying to shoehorn your technology into?
That's not what their global regulators are going to do.
That's right.
So the question before Emma answers is, do you see forum shopping where ICOs are going to, say, the least regulated or the most relaxed regulatory environments, and Emma says?
The global regulators talk to each other all the time. They are all working on best practice. They are all tightening things up. They are all looking. Most of them have established law that already governs all of this. And the key is finding and enforcing. So, for example, FINMA in Switzerland has just hit all of the exchanges with a questionnaire, about 40 of them. It is a challenge to run these things. So there is a large cryptocurrency whale who I don't even know how has a driver's license from Antarctica. I don't know about any of the lawyers in the room, but I don't know the securities laws in Antarctica. I don't even know how to ask. I wouldn't say there's a race to the bottom, but there is a very real challenge when you run these things of which jurisdictions are you going to try and comply with? And then are you going to have a whitelist? Are you going to limit it to, there's about 30 jurisdictions we understand, and the rest, goodness knows. And then it gets very complicated of, are you going to have a whitelist, or are you just going to sell globally and take the rest? And that's one of the toughest questions when you're running an ICO, because you can easily sell into upwards of 100 jurisdictions.
And I think you do have form shopping too with where you're going to organize. People looking to go in Caymans or somewhere where there's a low tax rate. But then you actually have to have a presence there and not here, and so we're losing that intellectual capital then to another jurisdiction. So I think there's certainly advantages to trying to keep that here and working with current regulations to keep ICOs.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Are people, from a technological perspective, designing things that they can shoehorn themselves into a CFTC regime or more like a commodities-driven regime, or are they still trying to stick with the securities-driven regime?
So if I catch the question, are promoters or organizers tailoring the product and the offering so that they get in front of one regulator as opposed to another?
I mean, I would say that would happen more if the regulatory environment was more precise, and if they I think in a weird way you have this industry that is kind of born out of cyberpunks, right? And this disruption mentality. But everyone that I talk to in the space, everyone that's building companies in the space, what we're craving is clear, concise regulatory guidance. Like for SALT, we didn't say, oh, we're going to go to the CFTC and then the SEC and then we're going to go to FinCEN and then we're going to FINRA. We were just like, screw it, let's go to everybody, right? And it was very expensive because there is no clear guidance on it, right? There's no, like when we were creating our sale and operating our sale, we went to our general counsel, and then we went to our secondary counsel, and then even a third counsel, and we said, make this a security, please. Please make this a security, and nobody could. So then then we're just go down that path, and it's this really challenging thing. I think that there probably is some of that happening. I can't speak for this, I'm not gonna speak for another company. I know that for us, we weren't trying to find the best case scenario. We were just trying to find any case scenario where we could find the regulatory engagement or the regulatory guidance that made sense without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, which just isn't possible right now.
Yeah.
So this is a more basic question. So what are the speculatory dynamics here? So other than people being bullish or angry about a certain token, what is going to drive the value of token up or down?
Sorry, was that the speculative dynamics?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I mean, really, it just in a true pure market sense, what drives the price of anything in the blockchain world up and down is supply and demand. You have these markets that are very open accessibility. They never close. They run 24/7. There's no closing bell on crypto assets, and you have a diversity of markets that are available to you. You have 40 to 60 markets on any given day. New ones are spinning up, other ones are closing down. You have a bunch of different options for how you engage with those. So I think that really what is evident, and I think a lot of times this is kind of more clear in blockchain than anywhere else, is that markets are largely irrational a lot of times. And you'll have something that is a known scam that people are just talking about. It's like, yeah, it's a scam, but it's a really well-performing cryptocurrency.
So let me reframe your question in terms of something I heard Emma say, which is three main types of players: cryptos, including the whales, VCs, and family offices.
I would add to that also hedge funds and other fund structures. And I would say there's probably north of 50, south of 100 hedge funds and mutual funds that have spun up in the last probably 6 months.
Okay, all the more to my point, which is, in terms of all of our anxiety about retail investors, it would seem to me that if that's right, a lot of this behavior is being driven by fairly sophisticated money.
I was at a think tank a couple of months ago, and there was one guy who'd run an exchange there, and then a lot of regulators and others. And I kept on making jokes, and the guy from the exchange kept on sniggering, and everyone else was just giving me these blank looks. And eventually, after about 2 hours, I was like, everyone does understand what paint the tape is, right? And yeah, I got that look. Which is, paint the tape is paying someone to move the price of a token by a specific amount in a specific direction at a specific time. It is a pre-Glass-Steagall classic stock market abuse. And all of the worst of the abuses are rampant on the exchanges. And they learn from Charlie Shrem fast. At the start of this year, they were deleting messages daily. They are now deleting messages on a 10-minute rolling basis. The bot activity is obscene. The chatter that you see in the price of all of the coins that are on the first page of CoinMarketCap, that's not genuine trading, that's bot activity. And the exchanges just don't care. But this is part of the reason why we're pushing ATSs to get up, particularly T0. There's a few others, because we want to see genuine exchanges that care about prices, that care about market manipulation, that stop the bot activity.
ATS.
Alternative trading system.
One more in the back. Yep.
Are you guys seeing any, you're backing these tokens based on, software applications. Are the tokens being backed by any tangible assets like real estate, or are you witnessing any ICOs that are being sponsored by real estate developers to raise capital?
Real estate is really tricky because of the REIT rules. So one of the great crypto secrets we don't talk about is no one is quite sure whether, when you invest your Bitcoin or Ether into an ICO, whether you're crystallizing the gain. One of the problems with REITs, which is the traditional holding structure in the US for real estate, is that the REIT has to recognize 100% of the gain on any property that is contributed to it. So no one has done, there's been a few, but they haven't been very well structured, and they've hit maybe 4 to 6 million, but no one has solved this particular problem. So we don't think we're going to see, we think there's appetite for, $200 to $500 million token raises that are asset-backed. But someone has to solve the tax problem. And when you come to asset-backed security, so arguably all of the security tokens that Argon has run this year, which is BCAP, Protoss, and Science, have an asset behind them. It is a fractional, non-voting economic ownership in the underlying asset. That makes it a collective investment scheme, and it makes the tax foul. We incorporate in Singapore, and I'm not going to go into the rest of what we do, but to make the money come in tax-free, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. So the main kind of thing there is a lot of appetite for it. The main thing that's limiting it is the limitation of the US tax code, which is 1031 and 1032.
Can I ask a question real quick?
We are out of time, and I want to be respectful.
It's a real quick one. Just
Caleb, take it.
How many people here are planning on doing an ICO or researching doing an ICO? That's a lot less people than we normally see in these crowds. That's not a bad thing. Yeah, that was just my only curiosity. Thank you.
All right, so whales, the telegram, paint the tape.
Unicorn fence.
Unicorn
The unicorn fence. Thank you for demystifying these other concepts. Please let me give a round.